Thus far, we looked at, again, very sweeping history of the history of homosexuality. Now we're going to focus on very specific events, particularly because they address the creation of a modern homosexual identity. And the first example that I'll talk about here is the trial of Oscar Wilde. So you might know Oscar Wilde. He was a very famous playwright during his age. He actually died quite young because of this whole situation that he went through. So today you might have these common stereotypes of what a gay man looks like. And a lot of times we kind of ask ourselves, well, where did these ideas come from, right? Nothing comes out of a vacuum. Things are shaped by events throughout history. And the trial of Oscar Wilde kind of shapes our understanding, our modern understanding of homosexuality identity. Okay, again, we're not saying that it's right. What we're saying is that it creates, if you will, the stereotype of a male homosexual person, right? So let's begin with the trial itself. So as I mentioned, Oscar Wilde was somebody important in England. He was famous writer who wrote about kind of working class culture or even critique of bourgeois society. And what happened in this particular event is that the Marquis of Queensberry accuses Oscar Wilde of being a sodomite, which, as I said earlier, right, the word sodomy eventually becomes to refer to homosexual identity by the 19th century, even though in the Middle Ages it was very, very much so an umbrella term. So what happens? Well, Oscar Wilde actually sues the Marquis because Oscar Wilde is actually married and he has kids, and obviously it's doesn't want his reputation to be diminished by such an accusation. So he sues, but the moment he does this, it puts him on the spotlight, right? Kind of like the Alice Mitchell affair, where the event takes a life of its own once it goes to trial and the press gets hold of it. So why is this important to us as academics or even as just people? Well, for the first time in history, we have a creation of what a gay man looks like. So all the stereotypes that you have about gay men probably come from this one event. I typically show a clip, not an episode, but a clip of Family Guy, where the main character gets injected with quote unquote the gay gene. And we use that clip because it epitomizes, again, these stereotypes of what gay people are like, not only from the way they look, but the mannerisms and even the way they think. And I always try to tie it back to historical context, which is the trial of Oscar Wilde. So Oscar Wilde, just the type of person that he was that he very much so critiqued middle-class life. So think of people living in Scottsdale and some people making fun of them, right? Because they have their middle-class life, they got their cars in their homes, and whatever else comes with that kind of bourgeois middle-class identity, and it's so superficial to some extent, right? Well, Oscar Wilde is kind of doing the same thing. He's kind of critiquing middle-class life, which doesn't sit well with him, right? Nobody wants to be made fun of. And also, he's part of pop culture. Everybody knows who he is. He's somebody important. So, he's an artist in particular. And if you know anything about art, particularly art is, we give them a little bit of leeway when it comes to, how they behave and so forth, because they need to be creative, right? So we know that they're a little bit eccentric, but that's okay because they need to create great art. So the trial itself is very important because at first Oscar Wilde is on trial and he's up in the witness stand and he's just running circles against these the lawyer of the Marquis, and for the most part it was believed that he was going to win this case. But then the lawyer begins to use Oscar Wilde's own literature against him. The things that he's talking about. Again, Oscar Wilde focused a lot on working class culture. And they make these accusations, as I said earlier. At first, it's not very successful because Oscar Wilde kind of basically says, how can I be gay if I'm married, right? And I got kids. That's just an impossibility, right? Kind of have that family, what is it, like a family shield on, if you will, right? Kind of using it as an argument. However, then they begin to accuse him of frequenting brothels. And Oscar Wilde taking advantage of working class people. And then things begin to take a downturn from that point forward. What ends up happening in this case is that the Marquis is found innocent of this libel suit. And then this kind of opens up the door for to go after Wilde, because if the Marquis was found innocent, that means that Wilde must be guilty of these charges, right? Of this attack that the Marquis put on him. So later, Oscar Wilde is actually charged with gross indecency. And this has a very important impact on his life because he's actually put in jail for it. And it's kind of difficult because at this time, again, as I said, the word homosexual is not a real concept quite yet. The word is actually coined, I think, in the 1860s by some Eastern European psychologists. And it's just a word at that moment, right? Kind of just addressing, certain, just the act itself of man being with other men. But Oscar Wilde is the one that kind of adds to it because of this particular trial. Now understand that his behavior is viewed as immoral, but not as a crime. Now this is during the age where the government, the state, is having a bigger part in people's lives. So they're controlling people's behavior in different ways. One of the best examples that we have is education. This is during the age where public education becomes instituted throughout the world, places like Europe in particular. And education during this time is created not because they want to educate you, but rather to control you. Education focused on patriotism and on nationalism, on creating a uniform language. Also, we see, again, the state taking a much more active role in people's lives through the implementation of food regulation, child labor laws, pension acts. So the welfare is kind of encroaching on people's private lives in different ways. And this is just another example, this case at least, is another example of the state saying, look, this is how you ought to behave. So by the late 19th century, which is late 1800s, same-sex activity now has this kind of concept of homosexual identity tied to it, become considered criminal acts. And then I'll talk about another example, which is very, very kind of funny, if you will, because they could not charge people with a crime because there were no homosexual laws at the time. So the trial itself, as I noted, kind of creates this identity. So prior to the 1860s, again, when the term first derives, the word homosexual, there is no descriptive qualities besides the act itself. By the 1890s, after the trial, the word homosexual begins to enter our discourse. So Wilde becomes what we define as the other. Now, Oscar Wilde, as we noted earlier, he's an artist, right? He is described as very dandy, well-dressed, very artistic. As an artist, artists don't work 9-to-5 jobs like the rest of us, right? They're creative at different times of the day. Maybe at 3 a.m. they're very creative, and this kind of ticks off society because while the rest of us have to work, they get the luxury of being creative. And he's also described as very effeminate. So these terms are not quite considered homosexual, but after the trial, all of these descriptive aspects become defined as homosexual. So this kind of flamboyant behavior and effeminate quality, artistic sensibility, become these kind of signs for society that there's this kind of inner corruption with him. So it went from just him being artistic to all of a sudden these being the signs of somebody that is defined now as a homosexual. All right, I'm going to stop it there, and I'm going to address another important event that happened in Mexico.